Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 287 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising covers virtually every conceivable issue as we've been traversing the collective experience of the pandemic over the last year and a half. And one of the most consistent themes that's come up over and over again from very diverse quarters is the urgent imperative for humanity to craft a new story. As Einstein said, it's the consciousness that produced the problem can't solve the problem. So at the heart of the human experience and the human journey from deep Neolithic times, Stone Age, shamanic times to the present, human societies have told stories. And it is around stories that we explain the mysteries of the world, that we articulate the ethics and moral codes that we all should live by, and we project through story into the future and amalgamate in our collective psyches and our personal psyches. Not only where we've come from and what we need to do, but where we're going to go. So the fundamental importance of stories cannot be overstated. All of us on our mothers' and fathers' knees are told stories, and it is through the stories that we shape our perceptions of the world. So today we're going to take a pause in the hustle and bustle of politics and economics and science and culture and public health and all the other issues that we've been delving into, and listen to a master storyteller tell us a story drawn from the Native American tradition that will help us all understand more deeply our world. But before we jump into that part of the program, let us take a pause, as we always do at the beginning, and just center ourselves in our bodies. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, and place your attention on your heart. And for the next minute or so, listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive, that we're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today, I want to recall the great mythologist Joseph Campbell, who wrote about 50 years ago, The Power of Myth, and his best-selling work, The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And you all probably remember Joseph Campbell, and if not, you'll certainly know Star Wars. And the great, not trilogy, it started off as trilogy, and then it was two trilogies put together around the hero and the vicissitudes of fate that go into destiny as the light and dark dimensions of history, personality, culture, karma, and vision come together to shape lives in a heroic epic that shapes history itself. There are many people that have been in that lineage of storytellers and myth makers. And if you just consider the power that a movie like Star Wars or J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings have had in shaping our perception of ourselves, one gets a measure of the power of story. And as the world goes through all of our upheavals, one of the ways that humanity can rise together is to embrace a new story. So we want to turn today to a master storyteller and elder, Michael Meade, who's both a mythologist, an anthropologist, a psychologist, a sociologist, a master of ritual, who worked for many years with James Hillman, if you know him, and Robert Bly, two great souls that with Michael Meade worked together and wrote together and led workshops and seminars and conferences. Michael's written many books. He has a podcast on myth that he delivers. And he has an organization, Mosaic Multicultural Foundation, and has for many decades now brought deep wisdom and transformation to the lives of many through his extraordinary capacity to bring the deep myths of our ancestral primordial time into modern language. So I want to welcome Michael, you to the program today. And Michael will share some of his thoughts. And we might start, Michael, with your own personal journey and how you discovered the power of storytelling. And then Michael will tell us a story, make a comment or two, and then we'll open it up to dialogue with all of you that are joining our session today. Michael, welcome.
Good to be with you, Jim. Thank you for all the good words and the meditation. All right, so if I start with my own story, and that's interesting because part of the idea that I work with is we're all living a myth, whether we know it or not. And so there is a thing like a personal myth, which is a story that's trying to unfold from inside the soul and the heart of a person, that we come here not empty and have to make something of ourselves. We come here as a self in the making by the unfolding of our own story. And so after I had started telling stories, a journalist asked me one day, how did you start telling stories? And I had never even thought about it, but it became really clear. On my 13th birthday, I'm growing up in New York City in a working class, really poor family. And it's my birthday, and I learned already, don't ask for what I want because I'm not going to get it, and it just makes my parents depressed for 2 weeks. And so I say I don't want anything, but my aunt asked me, what are you interested in? And I said history, because at the time I was trying to study history, trying to figure out what the hell happened here. And so she went off to a store. She was a notoriously short person. And she said, I need a book on history. And they pointed to an upper shelf, and she reached up and grabbed the book. They wrapped it. She gave it to me on the evening of my birthday. And I started to tear the paper off, and she said, oh, it's the wrong book. I got the wrong book. And so she tried to pull it back, and I'm pulling the book and saying, no, I want this book, because on the cover, I can see this flying horse. And there's a guy sitting on the horse, and he shot an arrow that's arcing off the cover of the book. And I really want this book. And she's saying, but it's the wrong book. And so I tear the rest of the paper off, and it says Mythology, Edith Hamilton. So it's my 13th birthday, and I get a book that's the wrong book, but it's the right book. It's a gift, but something I had to grab a hold of also. And that night I read almost the entire book. And what happened is I found a language that made sense of everything around me. And I didn't have to become older. I didn't have to become, I didn't have to qualify. I already qualified. This was the language that was going to turn out to be the mode for the unfolding of my own life. I didn't understand that at that time, but I understood that I had found a language that opened the world up and gave me another set of eyes to see with. So that's how myth entered my life. And I should tell the second part of that because it's important, which is to say 6 months later, I was in a little local gang and in a movie theater, and I went up to the bathroom, which was upstairs, and I found myself surrounded by like 7 guys from a different older gang who all pulled out knives, and they were gonna like carve me up there in the bathroom because of something a friend of mine said. They couldn't find him, so they grabbed me. And there I am on the floor in the bathroom of the movie theater, and something in me realized I could die right here. And I think at that point, looking back, my ego departed. And then out of nowhere, it seemed, and without preparation, rehearsal, I started to tell a story. And I told them a story, and in the course of telling them the story, you could see their eyes shift out of that long stare that people get when they're about to do harm. And the weapons went down. And when I finished the story, they just wanted to talk, and the leader of the gang said, okay, we're going to let you go. So within a matter of 6 months, I found the language that, in a sense, is the language of my own soul, and a territory I'm intended to work in. And then I became a storyteller in life and death circumstances. And in a certain way, a story saved my life. And I found something that was more powerful than weapons. I couldn't understand all that at 13 years of age. And it probably took me 20 years to fully get a sense of why this was happening and what my life was about. But that's a whole other story. I will say one thing that's typical in the modern world is there was no one around to confirm the fact that my entire psychic life had completely changed. When I tried to tell people, they didn't understand or they didn't want to understand. And so I was really walking around for 20 years looking for some kind of finishing of this initiation into the realm of myth and story. So that's some of my story. And then, so ever since 13, I paid attention to stories. And sometimes I would really study in the area of mythology, and sometimes I would forget about it. And mostly I considered it kind of a hobby. And it was later that I realized it was not even just an avocation, it was a vocation. And so eventually I started telling stories. And the way that I went about that was to just study stories from all over the world. That was my inclination. And then I would kind of forget about them, even though they had moved inside me. And then one day I'd be walking. I used to live in the city, and so I'd be about to cross the street. And just before I started to cross, after the light changed, a story would come to mind that I had read recently. And I began to understand that when that happened, that meant I was supposed to tell the story. That's the story I was supposed to tell. So then I wound up in this spontaneous territory of mythology, and I found my way onto stages and became a storyteller and did it while playing drums and so on, which I just happened to do or try out, and only later finding out that's an ancient tradition in many parts of the world. And I would be on my way to the stage after I had kind of established this this path of telling stories with this idea. I had everything figured out, and I was going to go lay it out on the stage. And on the way to the stage, a story would come to mind. And I learned the hard way. I had to forget my whole plan and tell that story. And so it's a living dynamic with the essence of story. And I know that most people have been taught that myth is something in the past, but myth is something that's with us all the time. The stories really lay in the dust of human souls, waiting to be stirred up again. And so in terms of telling a story right now, this is a story that I intended to tell, and no other story is pushing its way in. So I'm going to tell this one. As Jim mentioned, it's a story from the Native American tradition. It's told in a number of tribes, and so there's many versions of it. And this is just another version of it. I usually call it the old woman in the cave, or the old cave woman. And so it has an unusual beginning. It's what I call a folk myth. And it has an unusual beginning in a sense that it doesn't start in a particular time. It has to do with place. And so the way the story starts, to my mind, is that it's natural for humans to look for knowledge. We're always looking for knowledge somewhere. And the interesting thing is that the knowledge that we most need and that we're most desirous of is nearby, and yet no one seems to find it. There are roads now going in every direction, highways and byways and 2 tracks, and there are vehicles that can go off-roading, and people are moving day and night, all hours of the day and night. And yet no one seems to find the place where the knowledge is waiting to be found. And that place is a cave that in the ancient stories they say is always nearby. And were you to find that cave and enter it, what you would see is an old woman sitting on the floor of the cave and weaving. And she's been weaving what she imagines and she considers to be the most beautiful garment that anyone has ever seen. And she's been weaving it for a long time. And she wants it to be particularly beautiful. And she's getting near the finishing of the garment. And so she's weaving the hem out of porcupine quills. And in order to set the porcupine quills into the hem of the most beautiful garment, she has to bite down on each quill and flatten it. And so she's been biting down on porcupine quills for so long that she's worn her teeth down to nothing but nubs sticking out of the gums. But still she keeps biting down and she keeps weaving. And every once in a while, she has to stop weaving in order to go to the back of the cave. And in the back of the cave, there's a fire that some people say is the oldest fire on earth. And above the fire, there's hanging a cauldron. And in the cauldron, there are all the seeds of all the plants and all the trees and all the grains and all the fruits. And if someone doesn't stir the stew of all the grains once in a while, then those grains, those seed grains will burn. And if that happens, we won't have the trees and the fruits and the grasses and the vegetables. And so the old woman, who's tired from all the weaving she's been doing, slowly moves to the back of the cave in order to stir the stew of seeds. And as she's going back to do that, the black dog, what black dog? The black dog goes over to where she's laid the beautiful garment down on the floor of the cave, and seeing a loose thread, the black dog takes the thread and begins to pull and doesn't stop pulling until the beautiful garment has completely been unraveled. So that when the old woman comes back, all she sees that remains of the beautiful weaving she was doing is a chaotic mess on the floor of the cave. And she stops for a minute and then sits down. And for a moment, nothing happens as she takes in the effect of all this unraveling and the chaos that has come out of the beauty she was making. And then she herself sees a particular loose thread, and she picks up that thread. And as soon as she picks it up, she has another vision of a beautiful garment, and it's even more beautiful than the garment she had already been weaving. And so she begins weaving again the most beautiful garment that anyone will have ever seen. Some people, after hearing the story, say, damn that black dog. If it wasn't for the black dog, the old woman would have finished a garment and it would be the most beautiful thing. But the elders in the tribe say, don't be foolish. That old woman is the old woman who weaves the world. And the garment that is being referred to is the woven world that is before and around all of us. And the word perfect means to finish the form. And when the form is finished, it's over and it could be dead. And so if the old woman ever finished weaving the garment, the world would be over. So be thankful for what unravels things. Be thankful for the darkness that enters, because from the darkness, the next version of the beautiful garment we call life will be woven. That's what the elders say when they tell the story. And they tell the story in those times when life seems the most dark and when it seems like everything is unraveling and falling apart around us, and it might be the end that is coming. So that's the little, what I call the folk myth. And that's the tradition of the old woman who weaves the world, which if you want to look into other mythology, she would be connected to the sisters of fate who do that weaving as well. And I tell the story a lot now because it's such a condensed version of what we're going through. And I call what we're going through the recreation process. So you have creation myths, and this is a recreation myth. And I wrote a whole book about recreation myths so that people, if they wanted to, could find out that the end has come many times, but there's always a loose end at the end. As a matter of fact, the word end means remnant. It doesn't mean over and finished, it means remnant. And there's always the remnant from which things can be woven again. And so it seems to me at this point, we each are the old woman. We're looking at a world that is unraveling right before our eyes. Climate crisis says that. The COVID pandemic says that. The loss of truth and meaning says that. The prevalence of injustice and the disparity of economics says that. That's the world we're in, where institutions are collapsing and traditions are unraveling. And in a sense, we're asked to, I think, like the old woman, stop and look at the chaos. We are supposed to be, if we're going to be honest human beings, witnesses to what's going on. That's an important function. And then I think I want to make a suggestion, because the stories are there to be interpreted. And an interesting thing about myths is they speak differently to each person. That's the capacity of symbolism and metaphor and imagery. And so each person finds some place in the story that's meaningful to them, because each place in the story is meaningful and each place can be opened up and learned from. I mean, each time I tell the story, I'm in a different place in the story. And that's why stories are repeated and why they're consistently alive in terms of psychological knowledge and in terms of imagination. But I think the place that seems to me most relevant right now is the idea that if we do settle and accept the role of witnesses to the disaster that's going on, disaster being a star word, which means people lost their way and didn't follow the stars. But anyway, if we accept the witnessing role, we set ourselves up for the next role, which is looking for the loose thread that is the thread that is connected to our own lives. And if we pick up that thread, we then awaken this vision that's inside the heart and inside the soul, which can show us what path we're supposed to be on. And then we can learn how to take the thread of our lives and help reweave the world that we're witnessing falling apart into the next version of the world. And so to add one more idea to this, I call this process of witnessing the unraveling and being in a position, if we choose to be, where awakening the vision of our own lives gives us the opportunity to contribute our part in the reweaving, because the reweaving is going to take everybody, because the issues are so great, they're global, and no hero or single person is going to solve that, or a single belief system or committee of agreement is going to solve that. It's going to take a whole bunch of people finding their own thread and beginning to figure out how to add to the weaving of life with the thread of their own being. And so I call that process in which we're all invited to be on the threshold with the old woman who weaves the world. I call that a collective rite of passage. And you could see the movement of a rite of passage in, first of all, the thing that is being woven, which is called the world in the story eventually, and then that falls apart. So first step is things fall apart and you have to move away. You separate, as we have all just done with the COVID pandemic. We had to separate from daily activity, from relationships, from community, from jobs and work. And so the psyche, which is ancient and old, like the old woman in the cave, thinks that we all entered a rite of passage anyway by virtue of separation, social distancing, and keeping to oneself in terms of the soul is like the beginning of an initiatory path. And then the middle part is facing the unraveling and having to learn how to stir the seeds to keep nature moving in and help the movement of nature towards healing, which is part of the human's job because we're part of the reason that it needs healing. And that's the middle ground. And then the third step would be the return with the new vision, with the new revivification of life, with the new sense that we're in the next world, because the world's constantly being recreated. And that is symbolized by the garment, the most beautiful garment, the next garment of the world. So that's a rough translation of what's going on there. And I just want to emphasize this point that Jim had mentioned the hero and so on, but the understanding of the hero, I think, has become distorted. And so the hero becomes very kind of aggressive and masculine, and it's almost like the Hercules hero is going to lift the weight of the world. And a lot of people feel that now because of the urgency of the emergency in both nature and culture. But it doesn't work that way. And that kind of exaggerated heroicism is part of the problem, actually. You know, humans thinking that they're in charge of the planet and so on. But the other idea is to find our thread and to trust that the thread of our individual life, which in a sense is secretly pulling us anyway, that if we follow that, we will actually be contributing in the way that is most meaningful for us, each of us as an individual. And then the weaving happens through this ubiquitous unity of people who may never even meet each other, but are each bringing a thread of life back into making the garment, which is always, you know, as the story says, the garment is the world. So that's the story, and that's the beginning of interpreting. Repeat one more idea. A story affects each listener. We can only meet a story with our own life. So when I say dog, some people will see a cocker spaniel and others see a poodle and so on. Everybody has to provide their own old woman, their own dog, their own sense of the garment. And it's in doing that that the myth comes alive inside each person, and a person begins to find themselves living in myth, which is what the ancient people did. And I think we're being asked to do that again. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. That's a powerful story for our time, as you indicated in the telling of it and in the commentary. The world is undone, and the weavings of what is passing have really sown the confusion and the consternation in our world. And we are challenged to find the thread, both as witness and as participant, and come together in a very powerful way. So thank you for that. There's been a very active discussion in the chat. But let's start with some basics here. How do you understand the power of myth? Speak to us about how you understand myth in relationship to storytelling.
So one of the easiest ways to go is to go back to ancient Greece, because of the way they work with myth had so much of a rational approach that it's easier to work with than other systems of myth, which tend to be less organized. And so what the ancient Greeks said is there's two ways of accounting for what's happening in the world. And one way was what they called logos, which in this case means logic and reason and rationality. And you use that to account for what's happening in the world. And that's the main way that people use now. And so people are always trying to get to the facts, even though there's never enough facts to explain everything. And nowadays you have fake facts and false facts and other people's facts. And so there's some potholes in the path of logos and rationality. But that is one way to account for the world. And you can measure things that way, and you can check your measurements. And there's a lot of value and meaning in that way of accounting or telling and retelling the story of the world. But it's not enough. So the other way was called mythos, logos and mythos. And mythos at one level means story, at another level it means telling the story. But it's really intended to mean an accounting for everything in the world that is not simply logical. So everything that is not included in the logos approach exists in the mythos approach. So mythos is the place of emotions. They have to be somewhere there in the mythos side. It's the place of great imagination as opposed to great thought, logic, and rationality. It's the place of nature. Notice the old woman's in a cave and the seeds of all of nature are in that cave. Notice also that the old woman who seems, she's the woman who made the world, so she's not exactly a human being, but she's appearing as a feminine being and a feminine human. And it shows the connection of the human to nature in the cave and the connection of both to a kind of divine knowledge that imbues both with life and being. And so myth is about all those things that cannot be measured. Myth is the immeasurable. And if a person restricts their life to what can be measured, they're not actually living their life. They're living a condensed, organized version of life. The immeasurable, which some people call the divine, is trying to get to us all the time. And when the world is in trouble, the divine, the eternal, the imaginal, the creative tries to enter the world through those people living at that time. So I call it living myth. And so for me, it's not that we need a new myth. By the way, it's very hard to make a new myth. And if you read the versions of it that people try to do it, they're overly rational. Myth includes all that is irrational, and it's hard to make that, create that. Art, literature comes closer to it than anything else. But myths, to me, are ancient and immediate at the same time. So I think it's a matter of uh, entering the old myths with a different understanding and a different set of eyes and a different circumstance of life. And so that you could connect to Carl Jung's idea of the archetypes. Another way to look at myth. Myth is the story of the archetypes. The old woman is one of the archetypes. The word world, when you take it apart, has two parts. Word, W-E-R, which means, it means person. And then LD is really OLD, so it means old person. And so the word world means the old person that is the world. And this goes back to an ancient myth that we're all living inside a being that is living, that is called the world. So myth is all of that imaginal stuff and all of that irrational stuff and all of that essence of creation, the mystery that keeps the forest rebirthing itself. That's part of myth, and it's a different realm from logos. And the old idea was a person is only fully human if they have both logos and mythos. That was called the double-minded or many-minded person. And in the disturbance of the world right now, we're being called to be that kind of person, a person who understands the usual accounting for things and a person who's open to the unusual, the mythical, the imaginal, the spiritual accounting of things.
Mhm. Well, that's such an important point that you're making about holding those two dimensions simultaneously in our minds and hearts and interactions with our community, because that's what as Viktor Frankl wrote in his masterwork, The Search for Meaning. It's that capacity to live the logos from the point of mythos that gives us the power to shape our world in the direction of ultimate meaning. So I really appreciate what you're saying there. Speak to us a little bit about how you understand the hero. I took your point about, we've suffered too much from the archetype of Hercules, and that's part of our problem. What do you think the hero is comprised of?
So my introduction to the hero was, of course, through Joseph Campbell, reading, Hero with a Thousand Faces, I don't know, in the early 60s or something.
Yeah.
And of course, eventually I worked with Joseph Campbell. And so he was meaningful, and his work was tremendously meaningful to me. But I have to say that in Hero with a Thousand Faces, I'm pretty sure it was like the third or fourth paragraph on the first page where I had to stop and go, oh, I don't know about that. And what I mean by that is he called the hero's myth the monomyth. And my instinct, granted, he knew a lot more about myth than I did, and what he did was amazing with myth, but my instinct was there is no monomyth. There is no single story. I mean, as soon as you say story, people say, I want to hear the real version or the original version, but that's a contradiction in terms. The version means there's more than one telling automatically. There's more than one myth. And just as Freudian Western psychology that begins with Freud gets hung up on the Oedipal myth, when there's all the myths of all possible imagination that are inside each person's soul, I think that that Campbell got a little hung up on the hero myth. And so to me, hero has many meanings which wouldn't have to be masculine, wouldn't have to be powerful. I think it's closer to the person that's the main character in the story. So I wrote a book called The Genius Myth because I was trying to suggest that this old way of seeing hero and heroicism as overly masculine, overly powerful, and aimed at something in the outside world, which is gathered and then used. And there's a lot of things about it that are problematic, I think. So I use genius, which is an old Latin word that doesn't mean high IQ or tremendous talent. Genius means the spirit that's already there. And so I'm suggesting that each person born, no matter what their economic background of the family, no matter what the circumstances of birth, no matter what their gender orientation might be, each person born is born with an inner genius, which is the spirit of their life, which has its own thread of meaning and has its own aim. And that the way we contribute is by this awakening of genius and being able to follow the genius path, which is to my mind, way more diverse and way more inclusive than the hero's path. And so the old word hero has a lot of meanings. And I don't know that the meaning of it can be rescued. So I decided to use a different word and a different mythic imagination of what it is. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think we're past the hero's myth as it is understood, as I think it has led to superheroes rather than human, guides. It's led to kind of an exaggeration of power, and it seems to include this idea of humans' power over nature. The hero going out and doing it. And I think what's going on is a much more diverse attempt to awaken the multiplicity of spirits and diversity of imagination through individual souls, because that's the only way I can imagine we could deal with all of the ails and all of the illnesses and disturbances that are in both nature and culture, which is part of the unusual time we're in, where nature is rattling and culture is unraveling. And it needs many, many, many ways of seeing, envisioning, and working to bring things back into cohesion and some kind of balance. So that's my take on it.
And when you, if you had to define uh, what characterizes heroism in our day, knowing that the monomyth, the masculine aspects of hero are becoming anachronistic, particularly given world circumstances, how would you rework what characterizes a hero in the contemporary world of today?
Well, one of the problems is the literalization, which means the logos, a domination of experience. So people think that they are the hero. This is part of the problem, literalization,
Mm.
rather than what the heroic, I guess, could be called is an incursion of energy that is beyond the normal human pattern. So it's like a mythic incursion that gives a person capacities that they didn't have a moment ago. So people do understand that when someone does a heroic act, and usually they're meaning a heroic act that saved an animal or saved another person. And then they say that person is a hero. And there's the mistake being made over and over again. No, the person isn't a hero. And often the person who did the unusual thing would say, I'm not a hero, don't call me a hero. You see veterans coming back from battle saying the same thing, because what happens, it's a change, it's an altered state when the heroic energy is present. And it's there to protect and to serve something beyond the individual. So when a person says, don't call me a hero, they're telling the truth, because that's an over-identification, which then leads to kind of an inflation.
Mhm.
And so then you have people going around thinking they're the heroes of the situation, and often they're actually stepping on people as they're saying that. So if we would have to, redefine it or refine the essence of it, it's an incursion or an invasion, in a sense, of energy that's beyond the human, that has intensifies the capacity for whether it's courage or vision or strength is the way it's usually seen, but it actually can have many facets to it. Does that help with it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And, it comes back to this notion of genius, because another aspect, in addition to how you defined it in the Latin and Greek notion, was that genius was in some sense a visitation of the gods.
Yes.
It was a seizure of a particular person at a particular time, to do something that under ordinary circumstances that person wouldn't even have thought of, let alone had the courage to do. But somehow, in the moment, um, one is seized by an intelligence not one's own, and one addresses the moment. And a quick example of this, because it came up in one of our sessions on Humanity Rising not long ago, around the death of George Floyd. And there was a woman that said that the hero was the little girl that took the video, 15 years old, and just happened to be walking by, saw the event, and in all that consternation had the presence of mind. And it's in some of the interviews subsequent, she said, I just realized I had to do this. So that seizing of her spirit of an ordinary little girl, capturing the moment in that confusion. And it was that video that changed global consciousness, I would say, about the reality of race in our time. So I really love this notion that you're bringing out, that that the heroic moment is actually not exclusively personal. It's a blending of the personal with the impersonal, you could call it, that creates the moment.
And I would open up that a little bit more.
Sure.
Because she's at an age, my little personal story I was telling was at the age 13. She's in that age where I'm going to call it the inner spirit, the life spirit, the genius is trying to awaken.
Mm.
And so it very well could be that she's what we call a journalist, or she's going to turn out to be a filmmaker or something. In other words, it is not accidental that she would see it and know she had to record it, because whereas someone else passed by and didn't do that, because that's not the intersection of the genius of their own life with the activity of the world.
Mm.
And so if you look at it, you realize there's a brilliance in her that went, I think, beyond the fact that she stopped and recorded, and goes into the area of using the visual mode and so on, so if we go into like tribal conditions, she would not simply be seen as the hero of the moment. She would be seen as a person awakening in the moment to what aspects of her own life can serve the moment and everything beyond that. And then once you realize that that's happening, then you realize there's two things going on. She's still a 15-year-old young woman. And if she gets too much attention as being seen as a hero, that can be damaging to her psyche. So I think in a more of a, basic human situation, or even a tribal situation, she would be celebrated for what she did, and then she would also be pulled aside and be protected from people projecting too much on her. And when people say, I'm not a hero, don't say that. They're trying to protect themselves. Because what's going on so often in the modern world is everybody has these capacities inside themselves, and most people project them onto someone else. That projection is a psychological mechanism in which we can see a part of ourselves outside of ourselves in order to become conscious of it. But the people who are receiving the projections now are often receiving projections from hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, which is overwhelming to the psyche and can ultimately be damaging. So you see people saying, don't call me a hero, they're protecting themselves. And when it's someone younger, it's usually the job of the elders to step in and do a little protecting, so that she gets to integrate that moment in her own life as her own life, and doesn't get stranded in the kind of dangerous territory of being seen by too many people in ways that are not actually life-sustaining.
Amy Blumenshine just put in the chat that this young girl describes herself as suffering from social anxiety, actually.
Yeah.
And a police squad car pursuing someone accidentally slammed into and killed her uncle.
Yeah.
And so this point that you're making, which is really important, I think, to dwell on just for one more moment, is of the situational nature of heroism. That heroism isn't so much ontological as situational in this case, where you're drawn out into expressing who you most essentially are as it's relevant to the situation. And as you know from the ancient Greek and Latin notions of genius, genius could just kind of seize you for a moment and then kind of moves on to someone else. So you're absolutely right in saying that when someone calls you the hero, you say, no, wait a minute. No, it wasn't me, boss. It was something else happening. I was just a momentary instrumentality of it.
When you see, and what you're seeing happening with her, that's a really complicated situation. And if you take it as a story, you can start to unpack aspects of her life. She now has to somehow psychologically, mentally, emotionally integrate the fact that she captured the tragedy of George Floyd, which became symbolic for people all over the world. but now it's the same energy of death has entered her life from a different direction. And so whenever death is present, the psyche, I think, understands it as initiatory. So the fact that her recording was the recording of the slow choking to death of a person that she could relate to, that means she was in an initiatory process. And so the modern way of dealing with that, of making it very overt, and treating it as recording as part of logos and all that kind of stuff, um, it becomes kind of dangerous because people wind up suspended in unfinished initiations. And so every time I see that happen, I always think, boy, I hope there is an auntie, an uncle, someone nearby that actually knows her and gets the pulse of her own soul and can help her recover herself from what is now turning out to be more than one tragedy.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about initiation, because I think, as you know better than almost anyone, the ultimate purpose of myth, and story in some fundamental sense is to induce an initiatory process. And talk to us about how you understand initiation and how mythos and story assists one in the process of initiation.
So there's so many stories and versions and imaginations around initiation that always has to be simplified to be spoken about. And usually the study or consideration of initiation begins with youth initiation, because that's when, like with the young woman we're talking about, that's when it first happens. So the one core idea is that a person is born and then they go through what has been carefully studied and logos accounted for really well, the developmental process. You can really study the steps and what happens, and there's a lot of knowledge about that now. But that knowledge kind of stops at around 12 or 13, because at that point, what's needed is not another developmental step. What's needed is a leap into an entire life. And so people used to understand, I think, in a more immediate, visceral way, that the end of childhood, and notice the word end, the end of childhood is the beginning of the rest of a person's life. And that is not a maturing developmental step, it's the leap. And so initiation involved the practices that people used to consciously or somewhat consciously use to help a young person go from the end of childhood to the center of their own life, not to the responsibilities of being an adult, but to the awakening of the inner spirit of the life, to awakening to their genius and elements of their soul. So I think I had mentioned the first step of initiation is separation. And so separation in mythological terms, in mythic imagining, means death. So that's why people would say the child has to die for the person to be born. And so what we call adolescence and teenage stuff, that was the period for the second birth. The first birth is the physical birth, and the second birth is the spiritual, emotional, soulful birth. The first birth is about opening your eyes and being able to see things literally in the world. And the second birth is the opening of the eyes of the soul, which sees the world in its own way from the beginning. And so you can go on and on just about that step, but you can also just step off from it. Whenever a person has a brush with death, they are in an initiatory condition. And that means that parts of their lives can die and other parts unknown can awaken. And so I'll say one more thing just about that step, which is the two dynamics that were important, it seems to me, for those who were guiding the initiation was, one, to ensure that the young person awakens to who they are. At that point, initiation means to awaken to what's already alive in me, this kind of deeper level of soul. But because everyone is wounded and everyone has some experience of wounding between infancy and reaching the point of youth when the initiation is starting to occur, the beginning of the healing of the psyche of a person would happen in that initiatory process. So there's two steps that are, let's say there's three. One is the end of childhood, the death of being a child, in order to give birth to the human, the depth of the soul that was there to begin with. So that's one part. That means an awakening to who a person already is inside. Whenever I can with young people, I don't tell them you have to make something of yourself. That's what they're told by the daily world. I tell them, because you never know when they're going to have a dangerous experience. You already are someone. And what's trying to happen now is the essence of you is trying to wake up. So that's the second part. Then the third part is some healing occurs. So all initiations involve the wound of some kind. A scar is left to indicate that the wound was made conscious and attended to. So when you think about modern adults, they're usually missing this dramatic occasion of the awakening of their inner life. And many, and I'm sorry to say, often those who are given power are clearly not emotionally or psychologically adults. They're actually still children and act like children. And then the third thing is most people live right through youth and into the rest of their life with wounds that they've been carrying since early life without any attention to those wounds. And the problem with that is if I have wounds and I'm not aware of them, the only thing I can do is try to stick that wound into someone else so I don't feel it. So the lack of initiation means a lack of awakened, empathic, properly motivated adults.
Yeah, and the world is full of them at the moment, and we're being governed by them in virtually every country around the world. Uh,
Yeah.
and that raises in my mind, Michael, the question of, I would say, collective initiation and the challenges that are incumbent when the initiatory process is collective. The power of initiation, as you were describing it, where the Indian boy goes out and endures some rite of passage, comes back, he's being nurtured and guided by the shaman, and the little girls by the elder women as they go through their initiatory processes. And there's the cultivation of consciousness and healing in the process itself. But then when one goes through a collective experience, like, say, the pandemic, many people have said that the pandemic is an initiation. But what does initiation mean when, although it's collectively experienced as a transitional experience, there isn't any public consciousness or cultivation of the awareness, shall I say, in the process that would bring about the empathy and healing on the other side. Does that still constitute an initiation in your view, or is that just basically a missed opportunity?
I think it's both. I think we are in the midst of a collective rite of passage. It's a rare thing. I mean, I've been alive for a while, and the only thing I saw that had the qualities that are present right now was the mid 60s, when there was like that youth revolution of the 60s. And people didn't know how to explain it or how to handle it, and it never got finished. It actually dissolved, and what happened was another usual world came into form. So that's an unfinished version of it. We're in the middle of it, I think. So to me, the crises in the world are all aligned, like vertically aligned, because you have the climate crisis, which involves the entire planet, as people say, and everyone on the planet, even those who are denying that it's happening, are involved in it anyway. And then if you come down recently, you get the COVID pandemic, which has affected the whole world. They just figured over 4 million people died. And you hear death, and that's resonant to the psyche as first step of initiation. But those line up. And then the next one, we mentioned George Floyd. The next one is Black Lives Matter. And every human life matters in a way that people are not understanding so far. And there you have your justice issues and your issues of economic justice and so on. And then the other one that's really clear is the crisis of truth and meaning, because you have, you know, all kinds of the big lie here in the United States. You have the big lie. It's great. When something becomes like that, that's the symptom. And the value of it, it tells you the nature of the cure. That is to say, the cure for the big lie is a bigger truth. And so I think we're in this collective rite of passage that involves those kind of crises, which in a sense involve everyone. And George Floyd's death and the things that happened subsequently are proof of it. He's an American person suffering a particular American, you know, illness of racism, but something about it was so human that it went to all kinds of people who are having a different experience, but everybody can understand, I can't breathe. And it's as if we're all George Floyd. We can't breathe in the current circumstances. We have to find a new breath. Breath has always been associated with spirit, the essence of life. So I think if you imagine a rite of passage or an initiation as having 3 steps, the separation, we're in separation so much. Things falling apart. Every issue that comes up becomes divided into opposition. That's called separation. Separatio, it's called in alchemy. And then the middle ground is the ground of the ordeal and the healing. Both of those are in the middle. And it's usually called the liminal step, limen being the lower part of a threshold in a doorway, as if we're all on a threshold. And the world that we used to know or think we knew is gone. The people trying to go back are just they're on the threshold, but they're sitting on it backwards. Some of us are like the old woman in the cave on the threshold looking forward, waiting for the thread, waiting for the vision or the thread of vision that's going to be our part in it. The middle ground is where everything happens. It's where the vision returns. It's where the healing can happen, but it requires not knowing. This is a big challenge to the heroic sense of life. That is to say, in order to find out what's the important thing to do as an individual and as part of the collective, we have to acknowledge we don't know what to do. Not knowing is the step before learning. And so we're in that liminal, uncertain, we don't know stage. And what you were referring to is there's a final stage, which is a return with conscious recognition and appreciation and demonstration of all that has been learned, and that people have actually transitioned or transformed and entered a new stage or phase of life, which is what we're all looking for, which could be seen as the next phase of the world and the next phase of humanity, hopefully being more humane. But I don't think we can rush to that third step. I think the tension of opposites is the indication of where we need to be now. The purpose of opposites is not to pull things apart. It's to generate enough tension and momentum so something creative happens. The world is born out of a tension between light and dark. That's creation myths. And we're in that again. So to me, the richness is in the middle, the complications are in the middle, and the more we can tolerate being in this middle that's full of creative tension, the more people will get their own vision of what's next. And I'm working with the idea of an enormous threshold, a threshold of change that everybody is on, including those people that don't want to be there, because it's going to take this kind of humanity-based tension in order to create enough energy for people to see how to handle, how to heal, and how to make their way into the next phase of the world. And then, or maybe we could practice before then we need the rituals of return. Like in the United States now, as everybody's talking about returning to social life and all, but it's very mundane what people are doing. What people are longing for is not mundane. It's really for this big embrace that says we all survived a brush with death, and says, but at the same time, we all realize that we're here to do meaningful things, and we want to have that part of us embraced. So there's this, I think, whole need to relearn what ritual means and how it works if we're going to find ways for meaningful healing, and then ways for receiving and the return of those who have become healed, or those who have found a vision, or I don't know exactly how to describe it. We have to relearn that business of ritual of return.
Well, let's delve into this because we've talked about mythos and storytellers, storytelling, and the nature of the hero and genius. But as you're now pointing out, it's the power of ritual that enables us to create the kind of containers and passageways through which the deeper meaning can arise and be solidified in our consciousness. So talk to us just a little bit about the power of ritual in myth making and the hero's journey and initiation.
So rituals are like, some people say myths are the imagining of the story and rituals are the doing of it. I think that's a little simplistic, but there's something valuable there. Ritual, it basically means how people come together to create circumstances for transformation. And then when a transformation or life-changing thing has happened, how they bring a sense of grounding and a finishing touch and a welcoming to whoever has gone through it. So if we go back to the youth initiations, and at one time you were mentioning the native tradition in North America, a vision quest. So another way to understand what's going on collectively, we're on a collective vision quest. And the vision is, how do I and how do we see the next world? Because until we can envision it, we cannot get to work on making it. And the vision can't be a strategic plan. I'm sorry, that's too much logos. We're past strategic planning. We're in the great unknown. We're in the intense uncertainty of liminality. And so in order to be there, a sense of ritual is necessary. So I have to go to some example. I'm thinking of all the people who have had COVID and survived, for instance. The proper human thing would be to welcome each of them back to life because they could have died. But really, not only could they have died, they had a brush with death, which means something in them did die. And so the ritual of return would be helping to separate out what needed to die and what needs to be welcomed back. So once you see it that as happening for those who survived, you can apply it to those who never got the COVID. When people separate and we're spending more time by themselves, what happens is the deep wounds in a person, the psychic issues that want attention, get stirred up, partially by being more alone and hopefully facing what's inside, and partially because the psyche goes, oh, they've separated, they must be in a initiation. Let's send all the stuff up that needs healing. So the return, even for those who didn't get COVID, would be more along the lines of what got stirred up, what unknown part or unhealed part of you became present. Because if you can tell the story of that, and if it can be heard by people who actually understand, you're pretty close to now being able to make a ritual of return in which the person is embraced as having become a different person. They transited, they transformed through something. And unless that last step happens, it's unfinished and it has to happen all over again. So just to keep going with the COVID part, because I think it's pretty clearly a collective rite of passage. There are millions, hundreds of millions of people who have died, most of whom did not get a full or proper funeral. So honestly, I think we should be doing funerals now. And so once you understand ritual, and funeral is one of the greatest rituals, and it's one of the original ones. Some people say it was the first one, but other people say the first one was eating food together. Who cares? They're both pretty essential, and they're really the opposites again. But so a funeral doesn't have to happen right after the person dies. In other words, when circumstances make it impossible, then you can wait and do the funeral later. And we've done this, like with uh, people in the barrio and people in the hood, where there's a lot of death and there's a lot of confusion. We do funerals later when people are safe enough to feel what happened. And there's lots of ways to do a funeral, um, you know, that's at some distance from the time of death. So let me just say, I think part of the visioning in the middle ground of the transition of the collective rite of passage is the reimagining of funeral. Funeral was one of the greatest, most unifying moments in most cultural histories. Funeral was when everybody came together. Not only that, when a funeral was beginning, all commerce had to stop. If you go back into ancient cultures, the average time for the funeral was 3 days. And for those 3 days, there could not be any commerce. The roads would be cut off because they say when someone has died, we all feel it. And that's why the African proverb is, if you come upon a funeral, you have to join, not because you know the person who has died, but because you know death. And so funeral was the time for reconnecting everyone to the mystery of life, death, and renewal. And so that's why the end of the funeral was the party, the second line, the return to life by virtue of eating together and celebrating together and making a distinction between the living and the dead. When we don't have meaningful funerals on an individual level, we have unfinished initiations all over the place, and we have people walking around carrying corpses that were never properly buried. But on a collective level now, literally, they just announced yesterday or this morning that there's over 400 million dead. That's a big human funeral there. And if it's left as an accounting in the world of logos, it will keep kind of vibrating, if you want to call it a negativity or a death vibe, that makes the world less alive. And so we need, I think, funerals to finish that process and to remind ourselves that we are the living, that we could have died also, but now we are the living. And that distinction between the dead and the living is one of the final steps of funeral. And I hope I'm making sense here. When a proper funeral happens, the people who survived come out more alive. And that's what we want from COVID. That's actually what we want from climate crisis. Like the old woman in the cave, we want to go through the unraveling. We don't have any choice, but we want to come out on the other end with our fingers on the threads of creation and our capacity to contribute having been enlivened and intensified. And you can do that through small rituals and funerals. You can learn it that way. And so what I'm talking about throughout all of this is the great mystery of life, death, and renewal, or life, death, and rebirth. That's the mystery that we've all been born into. And it's the mystery of not just creation, but recreation. And like the old woman in the cave, I think we're trying to participate in that mystery that has so many elements it can never get accounted for, but it can be fully experienced. And ritual is one of the ways to experience it.
Mm. Beautifully put, Michael. That was beautiful. Thank you. And just one final question for our collective illumination here. As we go through this process, and I was thinking as you were talking about the inauguration on January 20th of Joe Biden, and how at the end of the day they circled the reflection pool between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument with candles symbolizing the 500,000 people who had died by that moment. And there was the concert. And I felt at that time that even though it was completely shrouded in logos, that it was a mythic moment where we consecrated and looked at the reflecting pool and saw all the lights of 500,000 candles symbolically put there. That would be an example of what I think you're talking about.
I agree. I watched that moment and was really struck by it. It was legit. I was really
Yeah,
curious
it was legit. Yeah.
who thought of that, because someone had a real sense. And of course, the pool, the water is the soul. That's always reflecting everything that happens in life. And then you have the flickering candle each, that's always been considered to be in the heart. There's a flame in the heart, and it grows whenever we realize the nature of our own flame, but it also grows when anyone else sees that. And so the symbolism was right on. And it was also the rite of passage from the previous administration, which was, a demonstration of the lack of empathy in a valuable way. In other words, you understand the value of empathy when you see where it's lacking. So it was a real marking, ritual marking of the loss of life during COVID, and even the transition from one administration to another. It was a ritual element added to what would be otherwise a preformative, kind of ceremony. I agree. The only thing is, I think it needs to go a whole lot further, in the sense that each flickering candle represented a life going out for someone, and they, in the logos fashion that is so dominant now, they have figured out that when each person who died of COVID had at least 30 or 40 people who were connected to their life who felt that. And that's the purpose of the funeral, is to get everybody who's feeling it into the same space, because there's not just mourning that's necessary, and that's a beautiful, meaningful thing, which is also part of the water, but there's also the renewal of life for those who are alive. But yeah, I agree. That was very unusual to see a legitimate ritual presentation in the midst of what otherwise is a performative ceremony. So maybe that's an indication of that we're closer to that doorway, closer to that threshold. But it's very hard. So when you get to the individual human, and when you get past the idea of exaggerated high testosterone heroics, you get people living through confusing life circumstances increasingly now. You get greater anxiety because there's collective anxiety as well as individual anxiety. You get greater fears and all that kind of stuff. And that stuff cannot be handled, by daily life. It requires ritual. I think we're being asked to reimagine rituals in ways that are meaningful to the individual and to the collective. And when people say they miss community, I don't think it means they miss standing together in a familiar place. The community comes from the Latin communitas, which means something so deep happens, it pulls everybody together. And one of the few things that does that is ritual.
Mm. Beautiful, beautiful. Michael Meade, everyone. Michael, thank you so much for your wisdom today, and for the depth with which you've told the story and illuminated things. I think we all feel more grounded in the depth of existence as we contemplate myth and story and initiation and ritual. So thank you. Thank you very, very
Thank you,
much.
Jim. Good being with you. Good luck to everyone. Find your place on the threshold. That's what I've been saying lately. Find your place on the threshold, because it's all trying to change.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where the heroic and the mythic will take place, on the threshold. That's a beautiful final image. We're on the threshold, and that's where deepest meaning and the opportunity to live large will take place. So thank you, Michael. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. We'll see you same time, same station tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to go to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And we're going to talk with His Excellency Mohammed bin Jarwan and Basma Al Zain about the imperative for tolerance and peace in our world. Bye for now. See you tomorrow. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you.